flowing so you know where you're going. So yesterday we talked about how when you ignore an argument, you're conceding that argument. When you ignore the argument, you're conceding that argument. So you obviously don't want to ignore arguments. You want to be able to argue against them. I mean, there's some arguments, maybe if they say like the sky is blue and we're all going to agree the sky is blue, you don't need to talk about it. But you don't want to just ignore the things that they're saying if they're relevant to the resolution that we're talking about. So how do you remember everything that gets said in a round? And how do you make sure that you address all of those things? Because if dropping an argument or ignoring an argument is conceding it, then you don't want to be conceding all these arguments for the other team. You want to be responding to the arguments that they're making. So how do you make sure you are paying attention to what's being said and you're keeping track of that? We call it in debate flowing. It's a technical debate term. It doesn't actually mean anything outside of the debate world, but we call it flowing. And what that is the debater's note-taking method. Note-taking method. It's how debaters take notes. We flow. So you'll say, I'm going to flow this debate round. That means I'm going to go take notes on what people are saying in the debate round. It's shorthand notes for each argument. Shorthand notes. And so you aren't going to write out the word the United States federal government. You're going to have some sort of shorthand for that. You're not going to write out every single word the other team says because you can't write that fast. You're going to write short snippets so that you can remember the things they said, because you only need to remember it for a short period of time. It's going to be right after they made a speech. So you just need to have something to trigger your memory. Lastly, flowing is a logical order to keep the round organized. Logical order that keeps the round organized. How do we do it? What do we actually do when we're flowing the round? So we know what flowing is. Flowing is how we take notes in a debate round. But how do we actually flow? So if we go to the tournament in a week and a half, how are we actually going to flow the rounds that we have? There's some supplies you need. You need 2 different colors of pens, and you need a notepad. You can use blank paper, but I think a legal pad, like the ones you guys have in front of you, those just regular 8.5 by 11 legal pads are really useful because they're going to keep all your notes together, but they're easy to flip through during a debate round. You're not going to lose them. They're not going to get lost somewhere. What's the method? The method that we're going to use, there are kind of 2 different steps. The first step is to divide 2 pages into 5 sections. So you divide 2 pages into 5 sections. And that looks like this. And then you divide 1 page into 4 sections. And that looks like this. So you divide 2 pages into 5 sections that look like this. Why 5 sections? Because there's 5 speeches in the debate round. And so that's where the majority of the flowing is going to be. But we know the negative presents their own independent case. And so because the negative is going to present their own independent case, there's one point where the first affirmative constructive, the affirmative constructive doesn't deal with anything that's said in that speech. And so that's going to be a shorter page. You don't need as many spaces. So that's the first step. You've got your page divided into these sections. Usually the way people do it is they either draw lines down their page or they fold the pages. And we'll talk about how we can do that. You'll figure out which way you think you're more comfortable doing it. The second step is to take notes for each speech. For each speech, take notes. So for each speech, we're going to be taking notes. This means we need to be writing down different things that are said, different things that we care about that our opponent is saying. It also means we need to be taking notes for what we are going to or what we just said. Because you need to be able to remember, oh, here are the arguments I talked about. Now, obviously, whatever you say in a debate round, you don't need very extensive notes because you remember it. It's the debate round that you're having. But what the other team says, you need a little more extensive notes. Next, you want to connect responses to the original argument. So you don't want to just say A, and then the other team says B, and then you say A. You want to actually write A, then B, then C, then D in this sort of fashion, where it's walking all the way across. You want to be able to show in the debate round on your sheet of paper, on your flow sheet, you want to have all of the arguments in order, because this way you're going to be able to follow it through the round. So you're connecting it to the original argument. Connect to the original argument. So you see at the very bottom of the page, we have 2 different arguments in these boxes. So I'm going to go through what those look like up here on our flow sheet. This is our pretend flow pad. So the first affirmative gets up and they say the sky is blue. Then immediately next to it, you're going to put an arrow. So we're talking about organizing it, going right next to the original argument. Then the negative is going to get up and they're going to say the sky is gray. You don't put sky is gray down here. You don't put it here. You put it right next to it. Then you come to the affirmative rebuttal and they say that gray skies require a blue background. Notice, again, right next to it. So that if I were to pick this flow sheet up, I would be able to look at it and say, oh, one team said the sky is blue, the other team said the sky is gray. Then the affirmative got back up and they said that gray skies have a blue background, and so blue is still the important factor. Then the negative in their rebuttal gets up and says the background is not the color. Just like we wouldn't say that this black marker is partially white. The black marker is on top of a whiteboard, but the black marker is black. So that would be the negative response. And then the final speech, again, connected. Final speech, the affirmative says, the blue background always comes through. Notice how these arguments go next to each other, all the way down the flow. And so this is the whole idea of putting something next to the original argument. And this way you watch the argument flow through the round. So that's why we call it flowing. Because you can see the argument flow from the affirmative constructive all the way through the second affirmative rebuttal. So this is why we call it flowing. This is an example down at the bottom of our outline of how this is going to look. So turn the page over, and we're going to just talk real quickly about what we're actually putting on the flow pad. What should we flow? There's two categories of things you should flow. The vital information and the valuable information. If you only get one part, you should get the vital part. So when you're watching the debate round, focus on the vital, and then if you can get some of the valuable, get the valuable. So what are these parts? The vital information includes the tag. And so remember when we had the parts of an argument, the tag was kind of the claim usually we wrote in the form of a tag where it was a short statement, just so we had an idea of what the argument was. So maybe the sky is blue, and then there's a piece of evidence that says the sky is blue, and you have some sort of impact. Because the sky is blue, people are happier, whatever your ultimate argument is. So the tag is important, because that's how you're going to reply to the argument. When we do refutation, like we talked about on Monday, you're going to say, they said A, I say not A. Remember when we did that? It's the same thing. So A would be the tag. And so you want to make sure you get the tag. The second thing is you want the evidence source. Just the source. You want to know, was this the New York Times? Was this the Wall Street Journal? Was this from Harvard University? Or was this from Ricky's dog? Whatever the source is. You want to make sure you know that, because you're going to want to be able to refer back to say, well, they claim that the sky is blue, and they quoted Ricky's dog saying that the sky is blue. It doesn't mean Ricky's dog's the credible piece of evidence. And so you want to know who that is, because you're going to want to weigh the pieces of evidence. And so maybe you've got your Harvard study that beats Ricky's dog. And so maybe your Harvard study says the sky is actually gray. So that's the sort of thing we're thinking about. Finally, you want to make sure the vital thing is where it flows. You want to make sure that things go in the proper place. You want to make sure that if they say the sky is blue, you don't flow the sky is gray down here. Why do you think that's important?
Because if you don't put it in the right place, you're not recognized, and therefore you might place in the slip hash.
Yeah, exactly. If you flow it down here, then the next thing you know, both teams are going to start thinking, because people are going to start thinking the arguments don't actually talk about each other, but they do. And so the next thing you know, you have two arguments that don't ever address one another. And at the end of the round, both teams might try to say that, look, you ignored my argument, you conceded it. When in reality, you've been talking about it, but you're just talking past one another. So you want to make sure you put it in the right place. What are the valuable pieces of information? There's three valuable pieces of information. We have the impacts. So what does this actually mean? Why should a blue sky make the affirmative win? Because the sky being blue may be totally irrelevant to the affirmative's case. Maybe in our resolution about drug policy, maybe somebody stands up and they say, individuals who are addicted to drugs live longer lives. Well, if their value has nothing to do with the length of human life and we aren't talking about human life in our round, then that's probably irrelevant. And so even though you conceded it, that impact doesn't actually matter. So the impacts are important, knowing how does this attach to the value and value criterion, and how does it make you win or not win the round. Secondly is the summary of the evidence. So what did the evidence actually say? So maybe the New York Times said that blue skies equal happy people. That might be really interesting, because if they were just trying to read this New York Times quotation to say that the sky is blue, but their quotation actually says that when the sky is blue, people are happy, then they aren't actually telling the story that their evidence is telling. And so if you can write this down in addition to just saying the New York Times, because you've got this tag that the sky is blue. This is your tag here. And then you have this New York Times is what you're citing. But if all you write is New York Times, but you don't summarize the quotation, you may think that even though this quotation said that, you may not remember it when you get up to debate it. And so that's why you want to have a summary if you can. And the last thing you want to have is any missing links. Now, missing links are not things the other team's going to say. It's not like they're going to get up in the round and say, so I'm replying to this argument, but I'm kind of ignoring a really key part of it. But these are things you're thinking of as you're watching the argument. And you think, oh, this is interesting, and that's probably when you're going to pull out your other color pen. Usually what I do is I flow the affirmative team in black, and then I flow the negative team in blue. Why do I do this? Because when I start looking at the flow, I know exactly which team I'm looking at before I even have to see the lines. If it's a blue line, blue writing, then I know it's what the negative said. If it's a black writing, it's what the affirmative said. And when I'm on the affirmative, I'm thinking, how do I respond to the arguments that are in blue? Last thing, let's go over a couple tips. Learn your own shorthand. Learn your own shorthand. Things like not equals to. Something doesn't equal. So A equals B or A is not B. I use this, the circle with the line through it. That's my not. I always use that when I'm flowing. Some people use the greater than and equal, the greater than and less than, for like this is more, this is less. USFG. USFG as for the United States federal government. USFG. In our resolution, when we're talking about illegal drugs, you just may want to say ID. Because you know what you're talking about. That's all we're going to be talking about is illegal drugs. Or maybe IDA for illegal drug abusers. So then you know, instead of having to write down illegal drugs, you know those words, you know that's what we're going to talk about. Maybe CJ for criminal justice, so that you don't have to be thinking and writing down long things, because you've got a lot of material you're going to try to write down on your flow pad. Next, write small, but write legibly. You can always use another sheet of paper. It's better that you write big and legibly rather than writing small where you're not going to be able to see it. You can always get another piece of paper out and keep flowing on another piece of paper. So try to write small, just because the more you can get on one sheet, the fewer times you have to be turning the page when you're up there before the judge trying to make your argument. But this should not be sacrificed for being legible. And the last thing you need to do is just practice, practice, practice. This isn't something that's going to come naturally the first time you do it. When we watch the round here in a few minutes, it's not going to be something you're like, oh, I got everything down on the flow. What I'm going to be able to flow is going to be a lot more than what you can flow right now, but that's because I've been doing it for 10 years. And so I'm more comfortable when I hear an argument. I know the pieces of information that I need to try to argue against it.